All right, guys, welcome back to part 2. We're just continuing. So, yeah, I'm just going to start playing the podcast.
You look at. These were all blinded
Probably draw for another
studies.
hour or two.
In terms of anxiety relief, those are tremendously strong effects. As many as 90% of people are going to feel significant improvement in anxiety. For pain management, for chronic pain, there's a high degree of success. So, people will vary depending on how hypnotizable they are and how regular they are about the practice.
Sure, man.
But anywhere from 50 to 75% of people will experience a significant reduction in chronic pain. And if they are using pain meds, they tend to be able to take lower dosage of pain medications in order to manage that pain. So it's quite powerful. Now, for trauma and things of that sort, it needs to be done with a clinical, I would hope, board-certified MD clinical hypnotist. And there, the success rates are quite high as well. And if you want more research
Thanks,
about
Lucky.
this, inside the Reverie app, there's a long list of resources. You could also, I can send over a good review article that David's written. These are, again, published in very fine quality peer-reviewed journals of the New England Journal, JAMA sort, and things like that.
Great.
In terms of similarity to psychedelics, they are quite distinct, actually. So hypnosis, being a state of high degree of focus and relaxation, is a bit similar to some of the so-called psychedelics. So MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, which it appears, thanks to the support and work of people like you and the MAPS
What up,
group,
guys?
and Hopkins in particular, Matthew Johnson, and I realize there are other people in that mix, but I have to just say, as a point, it's really exciting to see what's happening and the enthusiasm about building safe protocols that people can access after so many years of people having to do this kind of renegade or in unregulated environments. MDMA creates in a very atypical state. It's a state of high dopamine release. Typically, dopamine is associated with a focus on things external to us. Dopamine, being a molecule associated with motivation and reward, makes us want to do more of things that brought the dopamine, whether or not that's food, sex, online viewing of any kind, etc. It's not always bad, but
that online viewing.
Online viewing, whatever that is. The best way to describe the effects of dopamine are that there's a book, actually, quite good book, called The Molecule of More. And that's a great way to describe it. I wish I had written that book. I read the book and thought, I wish I had written this book. It's because I love the neuromodulator systems. And it is the molecule of more. And actually, anyone that thinks that dopamine is about pleasure, not motivation, or seeking more, consider this. This is an anecdote I borrowed from my colleague Anna Lemke, who's in the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford. The next time you eat a piece of chocolate or you engage in a behavior that feels particularly delicious, notice the sensation and the thoughts in your mind. It's rarely about complete presence and desire for staying present. It's usually a desire for more. It's this, I want more of this, please, as opposed to really basking in the experience. And I should mention that Anna has a wonderful book coming out in August called Dopamine Nation. She was in The Social Dilemma. She's an addiction therapist and psychiatrist, and talks a lot about the dopamine system. So dopamine makes us want more of whatever feels really good. And that tends to place us in an external focus. Serotonin, another feel-good molecule, is the exact opposite. It tends to make us feel good with what we already have. It tends to be the incredible feelings of warmth that, holding a child or a loved one, or time with your dog. I have this bulldog Costello, and there's times when I just sit with him and I feel immense pleasure just being there. I don't think I want 4 bulldogs. In fact, I definitely don't want 4 bulldogs. The snoring is loud enough already. But it's about experiencing the here and now in a full and complete way. MDMA is unique because it creates huge increases in dopamine and serotonin at the same time. And we don't ordinarily see that in natural experience. And it has this unique property of making people feel very excited and positive about their relationship to their internal state. And so it has a kind of looping back of a mechanism that normally would place us in the viewing of the exterior. What's out there? What can I get more of? Who can I interact with more of? What drug can I take more of that's going to make me feel this way? So MDMA is very unique. And I mention it because it has certain correlates with hypnosis in that it's a very focused state. In fact, so much so that let's just say I could imagine that if you're hearing music and you focus on that music, you can really kind of start to merge with the music. Whereas if you focus on your internal state, you can merge with your internal state. And that's why I do think it's important that some of that, if people are doing it in a clinical setting, be guided, because otherwise the experience can be sort of lost on whatever is external. Other psychedelics of the sort like psilocybin, LSD, they have a very sleep-like state. They tend to be more serotonergic in nature, and they are very similar to sleep in the sense that space and time become very fluid. Whatever top-down governing mechanisms exist in the brain, so-called, executive function, some of that seems to be dysregulated enough so that inside of those psychedelic states, and certainly inside of dreams, anything can really happen, and you can essentially see and appreciate novel associations that normally wouldn't occur in waking states. We should remember that the two extremes of human experience are stress and/or excitement, so highly contracted visual window,
We're
highly
gonna draw
contracted
this.
time domain, everything's sliced very finely. What's happening next? What's going to happen next? Think you're in the line at the airport and the person in front of you is moving slowly and you got a plane to catch. Everything constricted to right there, both in space and time. And then sleep, where in sleep, space and time are extremely fluid. Anything can happen, and you are essentially out of control mentally. It's just whatever is going to happen is going to happen. Psychedelics are very much like that, except that in LSD and psilocybin-assisted states, you're alert. So I would say that psilocybin and LSD-like states are similar to hypnosis in that way, but hypnosis has a little bit more of a rigidity to it. It's set toward a particular focus, like let's work on your control over stress or smoking or pain. And so I would say the three of them occupy neighboring spaces, but none of them overlap completely.
Yeah, I'd be so curious to see some type of multimodal study, and perhaps they've been done, but just looking at pharmacological interventions combined with hypnosis, right? So if we made hypnosis the default sort of control state, and then you had an arm that was comparing hypnosis plus fill in the blank, not necessarily psychedelics. Certainly, I mean, it could be an entactogen or an empathogen like MDMA. It could be a tryptamine like psilocybin, or it could be like a phenethylamine like mescaline, which has very different effects. Certainly, I think Michael Pollan does a good job of describing this in his new book, Your Mind on Plants. His entire section discussing the mescaline experience, which is really, in a sense, an amplification of the real in high resolution, certainly dose dependent, versus transportation a la the tryptamines like LSD or psilocybin. That'd be very, very interesting.
Yo, Sonny, what up?
It would. And I have to say, as usual, you're 5 years or more ahead of everybody else, Tim. And I don't say that for sake of flattery. I mean, you have a way of spotting the horizon, and I think we are so.
Yo, Vincent, tell your boy Jake happy birthday and early Merry Christmas. I guess that goes to all of you guys. Happy holidays.
We all have to eat sooner or later.
Yo, Faith, long time no see. Oh my goodness, welcome back.
Label and on-label, and then you got brain-machine interface.
Brianna, welcome.
Reading and writing to the nervous system and body.
Onion, what up?
And we always think of those as separate.
Thank you guys for being here. It's awesome.
As you're pointing out, I think
just chilling, drawing.
Is to consider, well, maybe
hey, yo, G.
At some point, a learning bout is going to be 300 milligrams of alpha GPC and a particular breathing protocol that will have a synergistic.
I'm gonna get my PS4 set up with Elgato, and we're gonna stream gaming soon again. Hopefully in the early January. We're gonna game a lot.
Is at Neuralink now, and they have other excellent neuroscientists there, and you can be sure that they're thinking.
Oh man, this is awesome. You guys are great.
And they're thinking obviously brain-machine interface and chips.
Let's learn.
And things of that sort. But you can bet, just given who makes up that company roster, that they're probably also thinking about ways to accelerate plasticity using a combination of brain-machine interface and pharmacology. And if they're not thinking about that, they definitely should. So I think for the typical person who's not going to plant a chip beneath their skull, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, which is that we need to think about what works independently and combining those for sake of synergy. That's what's going to get us where we need to go much faster.
I also think, just to build on what you said, and thanks for the kind words, that when you look at these possible synergistic combinations, you could also end up, and this is not a certainty, but it's a possibility, having a much more appealing risk benefit calculus, in the sense that if you can lower the required dose of a pharmacological intervention, if you can lower the exposure necessary with some type of neurofeedback or neurostim like a TMS or a TDCS or any of these other tools, if you're able to lower the required doses of several things when they're used in
Pikachu.
combination and get a similar or better outcome, it just has such incredible ramifications for the clinical use
We draw
of
Birdie
these
Chew.
things. Let's take a step back here. So now we've covered a bunch of the research. We've covered a bunch of the sort of tactical, practical implementations of some of the research findings. Now I want to paint a picture for people who don't know you at all. So we've already covered Costello. We have not discussed the fact that you have, looks like, full sleeve tattoos on both arms.
What?
I think you outed me. Yeah, you're the first. That's the
No
first,
way.
It's true.
All right.
Birthmark. They're all birthmarks, of course.
They're all birthmarks.
Kids don't start because they're like potato chips. You know, they can't get just one.
And we may get to aquascaping.
Man, this guy's like
That's a whole
really
separate
close to winning
conversation,
Nobel
so we
Peace
may
Prize,
get
and
to
he
that.
has
But I
two
wanna
full sleeve
rewind the
arms.
clock for a second, because I read your bio. Obviously, very impressive bio.
Interesting.
You've received numerous awards. You've produced.
Oh,
a
Merry
lot
Christmas,
of
JoJo.
work
Thank you.
with your colleagues and your lab.
Been meaning to visit
Let's
Australia
go
one
back
of these days.
to what happened to
Matt,
you
what up?
in July of 1994.
So in July of 1994, I was living in a little town called Isla Vista, which is near Santa Barbara. It's the home of UC Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara. Just as a little bit of background, I was not a good high school student. I had a very disrupted high school experience, despite growing up in a good area. Just a lot of tension and stuff at home. So I barely finished high school, but I followed a high school girlfriend off to college. Somehow I got in. At the time, I wanted to be a firefighter. Took fire science courses at Mission College in the South Bay, and I thought I'd be a firefighter. And I put that in my entrance exam, and somehow they let me in. But by the end of my freshman year of college, I had terrible marks. I had been thrown out of the dormitory living for getting in fights, something I'm certainly not proud of. And I was basically doing nothing. That summer, I was living I was squatting. I was living in an empty house because a lot of the houses were empty. I figured, why pay rent? You know, living in an empty house with my pet ferret. And to sort of set the context right, I think I was still grappling with a lot of anger and resentment and confusion based on having a rather confusing teenage years and a lot of disruption. Fortunately, I'd formed a lot of friendships and formed a community in the skateboarding and punk rock culture. I was fortunate enough to get to know a lot of guys that have gone on to do great. Like my friend Carl Watson is at Adidas skateboarding. I spent some time and got to know, although we weren't close friends, with the great Danny Way, probably one of the greatest skateboarders of all time, jumped the Great Wall of China. But I wasn't a very good skateboarder. I was not a musician. I knew how to do essentially nothing well. And July 4th, 1994, I went to a barbecue with some friends, and some guys were robbing the house that we were having this party at. We came back from the store, and we saw these guys essentially taking a bunch of possessions out of the house. And the thing erupted into this big fight, this huge melee. I definitely went in excited to fight. You know, I'd been involved in fights before, and I had an adrenaline-seeking thing. I felt like it was justified. I'm certainly not anybody else.
Happy holidays.
Essentially what happened was my friends took off.
What's up?
My so-called friends took off, and I ended up in a fight with like 4 or 5 guys. Knives came out, bottles. It's the sort of thing where quickly you realize that things could go badly wrong. Fortunately, I stayed on 2 feet, and nobody got badly hurt or killed.
So
Police
far.
showed up, and actually, because of the fact that they were robbing us, they actually congratulated me. I'll never forget. This is actually what made me feel worst of all. It's one of the police officers said, you know, like, nice work or something like that, and I just realized that I was in serious trouble. You know, I'm 19. I barely finished high school. I barely scraped through my first year of college. I'm living in a squat with my ferret, My girlfriend had left me. I didn't do anything well. I didn't know how to do anything well. And so that day, and I still have this letter, I actually sat down and I wrote a letter to myself and to my parents saying that I was going to turn things around. And I don't know why I wrote to them, because at the time I was kind of avoiding contact with them entirely. I've since formed a really good relationship with both my parents. But I decided that day that I would use the one power that I seem to have, which is to remember facts and information. And what I did was I left Santa Barbara. I took a leave of absence, went to a local community college in the Bay Area. I did 2 quarters there, and I just started studying like a maniac. First psychology, then biology. I eventually fell in love with neuroscience and related themes of endocrinology, and the rest is sort of history in terms of eventually going to graduate school and getting a PhD and becoming a professor, tenured and all that stuff.
Sheesh.
But it was one of those moments where I realized I am no longer going to be a young screw up. I'm going to be a 20-year-old screw up.
Next.
And with time, people are going to be less and less forgiving. And whatever had happened prior, no one's going to care. It doesn't even really matter. And if I do want people to care, and it's not like I have a need to talk about the challenges early on, but I need to get my act together. I need to do something. I need to get good at something. And so I became a kind of a maniac. Actually, when I read your book, The 4-Hour Workweek and the 4-Hour Body, which I read and loved and own, I should say, again, not for sake of flattery, but they really helped me. There are a lot of useful tools in there. There were certain things that resonated. I figured out that if I drank a lot of coffee and took certain supplements, I could focus for many hours. And then if I worked out, I built another capacity. And if I ran, I built another capacity for endurance. And
No way. Of course you would.
Between weightlifting.
No, Spider-Man was so worth it. No spoilers, but definitely lived up to the hype. And I was about to spoil something. No, I can't go that far. I was gonna say, now they can actually like. No, that's spoiling something. I won't say.
I live alone in a studio apartment, and I would set a timer for several hours.
Too fluffy for his own good, man.
I was allowed to listen to Rancid, best band ever for me, on repeat, and Bob Dylan. That's all. I wouldn't even allow myself to change music. And then I would just sit there and I would read my textbooks, underline my textbooks.
Ooh, shiny Umbreon.
I just decided I'm going to get straight A marks. I'm going to go to graduate school. I'm going to get a PhD.
Idea for
I should mention there were people that came along at various times and helped me, role models, mentors, people that spotted that. But it started with a switch that flipped on July 4th, 1994, and getting in a bad fight. And here I am.
Deciding to choose a different path. So I want to underscore or explore a few things, and I really appreciate you sharing this, because I think it's very easy for people
Merry Christmas, Nisha.
to folks with a bio like yours to sort of assume a certain trajectory, to assume that it has always come easy and that you've always, since you were 2 years old, known exactly which direction you were heading, which is not the case. One clarification, with UC Santa Barbara, this might be an important point, it might not. You did not drop out, you took a leave of absence. Is that right? Is that material to the story? Because I know in a lot of cases, there are folks who are kind of painted as dropouts, but in fact, they kept their options open by taking a leave of absence instead. So I just want to clarify.
Yes, a leave of absence is a mechanism that most universities have. I think it was designed for things like family situations. If somebody gets pregnant or they have a family member who's sick, that allows you to leave and come back. And it's distinctly different from dropping out. Although I was pretty close to dropping out, being forced to drop out for reasons related to poor grades and poor behavior. Fortunately, that didn't happen. I think it's a really important point, because we hear that Bill Gates dropped out of college, Steve Jobs dropped out of college, Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of college. I think maybe it was Ryan Holiday, who I don't know, who said something like that. The people who are doing poorly in college, they're the ones that should stay in college, because it's the one environment where everything's scripted out for you, what you need to do in order to hit the next metric of success. And a leave of absence is very different. None of those people dropped out of college. They took leave of absences that gave them an insurance policy that they could go back if they wanted to. And it's very hard to make it back into a system of any kind, but it certainly is much harder if you completely divorce yourself from that system. I am a believer in formal, rigorous coursework. I am a university professor. I know that college isn't perfect for everybody. It might even be the wrong decision for certain people. But if you're still uncertain about what you want to do, I think if it can be arranged financially and it's in the scope of things that somebody might want to do, I think learning how to sit down in a chair and force yourself to learn and then compete with others in terms of how well you learn that information, I think is a great way to evaluate oneself early in life, and it sets the stage right.
I agree with that. If you're open to it, and certainly you can say no, or we can talk about it, and then you can elect to have it edited out of the conversation. But you mentioned tension and stuff at home, disruption. Are you open to sharing a bit more detail about what you mean when you say those things?
Sure. So I had a pretty magical childhood, really. My dad's a scientist. My mom wrote children's books and was a teacher. We ate dinner as a family, everybody together. In the early part of my life, I acknowledged that I had great privilege in having that experience and growing up where I did, good schools, good public schools. I completely acknowledged the benefits of that, especially early in life. Around 13, when I was 13, my parents
Yoga Nikkei, thanks for
and
coming
either
by.
because of the time in which it happened,
We'll
or
see you
because
again for sure.
they weren't equipped with the right tools, there was a complete fracture of that picture. My dad was very much out of the picture at that time. My mom hit,
I can answer that one, Adam. Mine is Scarlet Spider, Ben Riley, the real Spider-Man. Apparently. No, the comic tried to make him the real Spider-Man for like a few issues, and then they ended it. It's pretty crazy loop, rabbit hole to go down.
At the end of this conversation, we're going to be okay. And at the end, we were closer. So we both have that, and I think for her, the fact that there was a complete disintegration of the picture, my sister out of the house, my dad out of the house, and me there, she really hit the skids. And home became a very quickly became a very empty and depressing place. It was just really sad. And I found care and love and community in the world of skateboarding. This was the early 90s, and there was this collection of mostly young guys at that time who would aggregate at Embarcadero Plaza, Justin Herman Plaza in San Francisco. I started going up there and hanging out at it's now the famed EMB, where it's kind of got a golden era reputation now. And that's where I learned that you don't have to go to school. There are a lot of guys not going to school. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of drug use, a lot of wild behavior, but also, I should say, a lot of amazing skateboarding and amazing characters and personalities and fights and everything. It was true street life. And so I started staying there. I'd stay at people's houses, or sometimes we'd even sleep there. And I learned a lot about how people outside the cozy suburbs of the South Bay, how they lived. I'm grateful for that, because it exposed me to the fact that many of these kids had no parental oversight from any age, that they had to scrap for everything. But quickly, I realized that I wasn't very good at skateboarding. I didn't have a future in it, and I wasn't going to school. My home life was really disrupted, and I lapsed into a pretty serious depression. I just remember, and anyone who's experienced depression, I hope this will resonate with, although I'm sorry that it exists, but there's this weird thing about depression, which is that it changes your actual view of the world. I remember leaving Embarcadero sometimes and looking up at the sky. Back then they had the Embarcadero Freeway, and thinking, the sky is so sad. Like, not the sky as a separate object, but that this scene of this sunset is so sad. And actually yesterday I was thinking about this, because there's this beautiful sunset where I live, and I thought, gosh, I haven't felt sad at the view of the natural world in so long. And so it's clearly a shift in my internal state. And fast forward, what happened was, eventually the school picked up on the fact, my high school picked up on the fact that I wasn't going. They called me in at some point. I was sitting down with a school counselor, and they had this guy in the room with me, sitting there. And pretty soon I realized that I was in a different kind of situation. And I realized they were going to probably try and take me away because I was completely truant. I hadn't gone to school. I was clearly depressed. So that's what happened. Against my will.
Didn't miss much. We just started drawing right away.
I was taken to a place up the peninsula,
finishing off the
which was
podcast we
neither
started
a juvenile hall
in the
nor
previous
a
one.
psychiatric hospital, but we were under lock and key. And I was in there with kids that had dealt with everything from sexual abuse to hardcore substance abuse issues. I'll never forget this. They said the kids in the ward next door, they're crazy because they're really young. And the adults in the ward on the other side, they're crazy. But you guys, you're not crazy. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous because they're probably saying the same thing to the ones on the other side. But I had no one to call. I called my skateboard team manager out of sympathy, not because I was any good. I'd got put on a wheel company and a truck company for skateboarding. And I called the guy and I said, I don't know what to do. I'm in this place. And I'll never forget, he said, look, I can barely take care of myself, and you're the most normal guy I know. And I realized at that point, I'm like, I'm really alone here. So the long and short of it was I did the work. I put my trust in the counselors that were there. They seemed like good people. And,
Nice.
I did the work, but it's part of an agreement for getting let back into school. Actually, it's part of an agreement for being let out. I had to do weekly therapy. And I was fortunate enough that I got placed working with somebody who understood my particular needs, worked with adolescents, and really encouraged me to start exploring my mind. Certainly the situation I was in, but encouraged me to start meditating. He gave me John Kabat-Zinn's book, Wherever You Go, There You Are. He saw how much physical energy I had, and he encouraged me to start running. I was always hurting myself skateboarding, and he said, well, maybe running or swimming. And running and swimming are amazing because unless you really do it wrong, you can go and go and go. It's just I could burn off all that anger and energy over time. And then I started getting into weightlifting, and the weightlifting is kind of a double-edged sword, I should mention. I think it's one of those things that is great, but
Cool.
if you exceed a certain size, it can actually make people kind of scared of you. Sort of like the tattoos thing. A lot of the reason why I cover up tattoos is because then people just see your tattoos. But it's true. I started getting tattooed pretty young. The wrong way. Don't do it this way with India ink and a needle. This was before. This was autoclaves. Bad. Don't do it. But I decided at that age that the therapy and this one person who seemed to really care about my mental and physical well-being and would spend the time was really worth investing in. And I hid it from everybody because no one did therapy then. No one talked about it. It's like late 80s, early 90s. Nobody did that. And I will confess, I don't think I've ever said this publicly, but I've found a way, either through insurance or through my own income. I've continued therapy with that same individual now for 32 years.
Wow.
And so I confess I do 3 sessions a week of psychoanalysis,
Interesting.
remote or in person. And I know people have they do the other kind of eye roll, not the Spiegel eye roll test, but the other kind of eye roll when you say psychoanalysis. I think an exploration of the mind is extremely powerful. It has to be done with the right person. And there's only one person I know who's done this kind of extended work for so many years, and that's the late Oliver Sacks, who's a kind of a hero of mine. Also worked with a psychoanalyst for many, many years. And so psychoanalysis, a fight on July 4th, 1994, a lot of attempt to both stabilize my mind and also organize my behavior. Those things go hand in hand, of course, but also biology to leverage. I guess you could call it biohacking, or you could call it, I just call it biology. I mean, when I learned, for instance, that taking 1,000 milligrams per day of EPA, essential fatty acids, not just fish oil, but getting above that threshold, is as effective as antidepressants in double-blind placebo-controlled studies. When I saw those papers, I realized, well, I probably have a bit of a leaning toward depression. I'm going to do that. Now, did I do that and drop therapy? No, I do that and therapy, and I train, and I try and work on my sleep. It's a constant process. But biology and the information contained in books like yours, and hopefully in the information that I'm trying to put out into the world now, that stuff helps in a major way too. So it was a multi-pronged support system, and many incredible mentors along the way. But I was definitely at the edge. I know you've talked about this publicly too. I mean, there were times when I just thought, like, why continue? And I'm fortunate nowadays, I feel very far from that. There's a saying in the world of addiction and addiction treatment, which is that no matter how far you drive, you're always the same distance from the ditch. That, I would say, is true of addiction. Fortunately, at least in my own experience, that is not true of depression. I have vowed to never go back to a place where living seems meaningless. And anyone who's been close to that place, all I can say is the work works, whether or not it's therapy, biology, et cetera. You have to do it. And there are things that can accelerate that process, but it's an ongoing battle, to be honest.
Well, you're fighting the good fight, man. I'm certainly right in there with you. How does it feel to talk about this stuff?
It's interesting. I always get a little quaky on this. I would say there are only two things that will always consistently make me cry, and those are the thought of, I don't even want to talk about it for too long because I prefer not to cry, but one would be when my bulldog Costello goes. We're very bonded, and he's close, unfortunately, so he's in his final years. And the other is when I think about my mentors, in particular one passing away. Talking about this gets me in a mode where it's uncomfortable. I'm definitely uncomfortable at this moment. I'm okay to talk about it because I think these issues are important, and I wholeheartedly believe that many people struggle with them. You know, I'm always conscious of protecting the people in my life who were doing the best they could with what they had. So, you know, my parents are good people. That generation didn't have the tools that I had access to, and I do hope the next generation will have access to more tools. So I want to protect them. They are, you know, I'm blessed. I acknowledge my privilege. And I don't say that for political reasons, by the way. I just want to say I acknowledge that I was born into a pretty fortunate or very fortunate situation that provided buffers. And I only know my own experience, but I acknowledge it as real.
Thanks for sharing all that. And a mutual friend has prompted me to ask about the Hoffman process.
The Hoffman process. So the Hoffman process is it's a personal development process. It's a full immersion, week-long process. I think it used to be 2 weeks. I don't want to give away too much about it.
Scarlett, what
if
up?
one were to go, you want to have the experience for the first time.
Alex, yes, I am.
Expecting or knowing what's coming.
There's
It involves
another
a lot of both physical
Hogwarts piece.
and kind of emotional purging.
Oh, that reminds me. I still have to recreate this one.
Go. You don't publicly share any of the issues that you're grappling with.
So
There is a teacher there that you communicate with and who knows a
lots
lot
of
about your
Harry
situation.
Potter
There's a lot of work that you
commissions.
do beforehand and paperwork, so they really know closely what you're grappling with. And you do get to know people there, but there are strict rules: no romantic relationships, no discussion of politics, no discussion of work, no discussion of sports. And you
all
quickly
right,
find
next I
that
gotta
you
figure
realize
out
that you spend
what
a
we're
lot of time
drawing.
thinking about and talking about those things in the outside world, and B, that there are other ways to connect with people that are very authentic that don't involve those things.
Oh,
Hoffman
here.
process was one of several things for me that was transformative. For me, it was most transformative in the realm of forgiveness. I felt completely resolved of my challenges with, you know, inability to focus, complete work, structure,
got it,
etc.
got it,
I'd
got it.
solved all that. I learned how to work hard, perform well by the time I went to Hoffman, which was in my early 40s. I'm 45 now. I learned how to control my physical landscape as best as one
Next
could or should.
is this
I went there
person
thinking, like, why would I
with
go
a
here?
snow
What's the
runt.
purpose in going? And
No
yet
way.
I realized that I harbored a lot of resentment, mostly toward family members, but also toward experiences and people outside my family. And I almost got kicked out of Hoffman the first day, not for misbehavior, but because I slept through the first day. I'd been working so hard. They kept saying, you're trying to escape by sleeping. And I'm like, I'm just tired. I'm just, like, they take really good care of you there.
Perfect.
I've actually never felt so nurtured. I'm not somebody who accepts nurturing very easily. I like to think I'm more of a caretaker and I'm more of a kind of caretaker loner type than being taken care of. And Hoffman, I felt comfortable to be taken care of in certain ways. And I discovered in doing the work that there were all these resentments. And I was able to purge those resentments. And I have to say, it completely erased all feelings
Snow
that
rat.
I was wronged by anybody or anything. And that's powerful. And it's completely behavioral in nature. There's no pharmacology there. I would say Hoffman is among the 2 or 3 things that, or maybe 4 or 5 things that were really transformative
Whoa.
for me. And there is a price point, but they do have a
Adam,
scholarship
I might take you
program
up on
that's
that
been
offer.
established thanks to the generosity.
We had this like European
people that can't afford the price
bakery here called the British Pantry, and they stocked like some of the craziest flavored chocolates. Surprise me. Maybe there's something in Canada that you might want. Let me know.
And it
This
is
goes for all of you
powerful, and
guys.
it does last. In fact, the reason I decided to go to Hoffman was because somebody, actually a mutual friend of ours, Tim, who I don't think went, Wendy Yalom, who I know from way back when. We haven't been in touch in years, but I think she said something about Hoffman, and she said she knew somebody who went, and I contacted that person, and that person said, I went to Hoffman, and 10 years later, it still has a profound positive effect on my life, and I found it to be more useful than any other therapy or training of any kind. That's my Hoffman story, and it's powerful.
And for people who want to hear more about Hoffman, I talk about it at length also with Blake Mykoski in the last conversation I had with him, so people can find that episode. You mentioned one of 4 or 5 things. What are some of the other things that have had a disproportionate positive impact?
This is a broad category, but get your biology right. Start with sleep. Figure it out. Figure out how to get your sleep right, because it's the fundamental layer of mental health. So get that one right. Other things in the biological category are learn how to focus, learn how to defocus, learn how to flip the switch on, learn how to flip the switch off, get good at sleeping. Of course,
not
exercise
had
of various
Jaffa
kinds is good
cakes.
and all the other
That sounds
things, but there's
delicious.
that physical bin, and those are the primary levers there. I do think some form of exploration, whether or not it's psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, journaling, or some sort of internal reflection that's somewhat unregulated, but obviously not damaging to you or anyone else. So don't punch concrete walls, but have the ability to sit down and data dump and reflect. If you can't afford therapy, reflect on what you're seeing and reading and feeling. Have the ability to experience what's internal. So that would be the second one. The third one is, and I realize there's some issues around legality and things, and right now everything's in transition. I was part of a clinical trial, so I can safely say this. I do think that there are certain aspects to, let's just call it what it is, either plant medicine, or I was part of an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial that was extremely valuable. There's no question to me that that's a powerful mover of one's ability to feel comfortable in internal state. The way I would just briefly describe that experience for me is that I could feel and perfectly fine from here to here and from the belly button down, but I had this feeling always that I couldn't kind of experience things in mind and body at the same time. I know this is going to sound really wacko to people who maybe haven't experienced this, but somehow in that brief experience, I was able to resolve that, and I now experience my nervous system as a complete entity. And I do not think people should cowboy this stuff and do it on their own, or try and do therapy for their friends, or do this on their own. I don't think this is something that people should play around with. These are very powerful tools. You should do this with a board certified MD, sign up for a clinical trial. Hopefully this will be done in these sorts of medical settings soon, legally, and you don't have to be part of a clinical trial. But if you struggle ongoing in some way, I do think there's utility there. So that's another bin. And then there's another bin, which for me has been very powerful, which is stay on the adventure, continue to have fun. It's so easy to forget to have fun when you're doing all these other things. Like, stay in the adventure and don't get killed doing it, but really try and keep exploring. I do believe these dopamine systems are positively reinforced by novelty and exploration. We know that. And by venturing into new territories. And that requires getting certain things wrong. It means going to a retreat that sucks. It means taking a class that is not that interesting. It means finding out that, a particular relationship is not right for you. But it's important to stay in a mode of adventure, because that's fundamental to the human experience, and it's fundamental to these neurochemical systems as well.
A couple of points I'd love to underscore here. So the biological piece, you've discussed in other places this principle, it's a quote of sorts, a maxim that I think is really worth remembering. And I'm saying that to myself as much to anyone listening. That is, you cannot control the mind with the mind. And whether or not there might be exceptions to that, I think is a general rule.
Runt.
Using
Oh, that's so cute.
the bidirectionality, as you've mentioned, of sort of body, mind, body, and when in doubt, working through your fuller biology is incredibly powerful. I mean, for me, like, to get out of my head, I need to get into my body. There's just no metacognitive way generally for me to otherwise do that. Or if there is, it's just much more difficult. I've even told my girlfriend, I'm like, if I'm trying to figure out what is bothering me and I spend more than like a half hour on it,
Snow,
just
what
tell
up?
me to go to the gym and lift heavy things for at least 30 minutes.
What the heck is a Jaffa cake?
Best remedy in the world.
And then I come out, I'm like, yeah, that bullshit's fine. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
And that's what was necessary. On the adventure side, actually, before I get to the adventure side, just a quick note.
Oh my god,
on
those look
Costello,
amazing.
Because I think a lot about my dog Molly and mortality, and it's like so easy to get sad. And
how old is she?
She's 7, but she's had some health issues. She's had 2 spinal surgeries.
Turn her into a cartoon.
And if you haven't looked into the canine research with rapamycin, I would look into that. It's very, very compelling. So that might be...
Thank you. I'll do that. I listened to your podcast with Peter Attia, and a lot of discussion about rapamycin. I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, it's worth checking out. There's also a separate episode with David Sabatini of MIT, who is a genius and a sort of mTOR wizard. Who's
that family? He has a brother, Bernardo Sabatini, who's a famous neurobiologist at Harvard, who I know quite well. And their dad, there's another Sabatini who was at NYU Med. So those Sabatinis, they're kind of like the Kornbergs. Kornberg discovered RNA. His son discovered the structure of RNA. They both got Nobels, and I think their brother is an immunologist, something like that. So if you're thinking about changing your last name, Sabatini or Kornberg is a good one to select.
Yeah, not bad. Yeah, they come from the Secretariat stock of the scientific gene pool.
That's right.
Exactly.
On the adventure side, so you said don't die or don't let something kill you, which I think is a perfect segue to, as I'm reading it from a paragraph from Outside Magazine, Huberman was about 40 miles off the coast of Mexico and 40 feet below the periwinkle surface of the ocean. What does this refer to?
Oh my, yeah. So before I went to Hoffman, I was still working out some things. The quick backstory of this is in 2016, I decided I was going to shift a lot of my laboratory work toward humans. I understand the issues of animal research and why it's important. My lab still does work on mice because there's certain things you can only do on mice, but I want to work on humans. And I want to use virtual reality to induce fear in the laboratory and study stress and fear and other brain states. And we realized that VR, as it stood at the time, was just pretty lame. It was computer-generated images. It didn't have 360 video or sound. And so I got linked up with a guy named Michael Muller, Muller, who's a very, very famous photographer in Hollywood mostly. Does all the Marvel stuff. He's shot everybody. You just can go to his website. It's kind of just a constant scroll of iconic images. Muller and I got to be friends, and the reason I was excited about getting to know him is because a hobby of his is that he takes photos of great white sharks underwater. He brings these giant strobe lights underwater. And Muller is, you hear about the character, the Wolverine, Hugh Jackman, right? Muller is a Wolverine. He's kind of hunched over, and he's the nicest guy in the world. But it was immediate friendship. But he loves adventure. He's got a family, kids, everything. But he loves adventure. And he said, and this is my best Muller impersonation. He's like, bro, you gotta come down to Guadalupe. The sharks are there. And I was like, well, what are we gonna do? And he's like, well, we'll just film them with 360 cameras. So in 2016, we went down there and we filmed great white sharks as a stimulus for this fear laboratory that we were building and got 360 video. And the way we did that was that Muller and a couple other guys, these expert great white shark divers, would leave the cage. You lower the cage about 40 feet below and they leave the cage to come back in, so-called cage exiting. Definitely illegal to do. We got permits from the Mexican government because this was for a scientific study.
I would have loved to see that permitting process. Anyway, continue.
That was something else. So we got the footage, brought it back, built this thing up. And then what happened was in the subsequent year, the technology for VR really improved. So we decided we were going to go back. And I decided, for whatever reason, that I was going to cage exit also. I actually learned how to scuba dive for the first trip, but I had stayed in the cage. And so the second trip, we went out there, and I brought a good friend of mine who's actually a mutual friend through Blake Mykoski. Pat Dossett is a former SEAL team guy. I brought Brian McKenzie because Brian McKenzie learned how to scuba dive in a lake in Oregon, and his first ocean dive was cage exit with great whites. Like, now, of course, right. The guy has unscared tattooed on his knuckles. I know he was featured in a number of your books. So it was Brian, Pat, me, and some other guys. We went out there with the intention of getting better footage to create a very realistic VR experience of great white sharks. So what happened was on the first day, I decided I'm not going to cage exit today. Let Pat go. He's the SEAL team guy. He'll do it. He did it, of course, masterfully the first time, went a few meters beyond everybody because those guys aren't competitive or anything. Anyway, it all worked out. But the first day I was in the cage. So I went down. I've been in the cage before, and you're breathing off a hookah line, which is up to the surface. You're not on scuba. And the reason you don't bring scuba is because you don't want to take up too much space in the cage. So the other divers, Muller and a couple other guys, had left the cage. And I was there just watching the sharks and really enjoying it. I'd been down there the previous year. And these great white sharks, their girth is incredible. And they come at you on like a Volkswagen, and they'll stop right in front of you and hover. They'll eyeball you and then disappear into the darkness. So it's really amazing. And I realized as I was down there, I'm like, I'm alone in the cage this time. I've never been alone in the cage. We had a lot of sharks that day, so I was moving around and swiveling around a lot. And then all of a sudden, I had no air, nothing, just nothing coming through the mouthpiece. And I looked up, and the hookah line got all boa constrictored up. So I popped up to it thinking, oh, I'll just untangle this thing. And it's like hard as concrete. It's like, oh, good. So I took another suck of air and nothing. And I looked down, there's safety tanks in the two corners. So I spit out the mouthpiece. I dropped down in the safety tanks, open them up, and the needle doesn't move. They're empty.
Oh, God.
This is like the biggest nightmare. And it's interesting, we were talking about Costello. I had one thought at that moment, a totally inefficient use of mental space. But the one thought was, I'm going to go home alive. I'm going to see Costello. He just popped into my head. So this stuff really does happen, apparently.
This guy really cares about his dog.
Nothing off the safety tanks. So I decided I got to get out of here. Well, there's sharks everywhere, but I've got to get to the surface, and you're just desperate for air. So I pop up to the top of the tank, and I've got a weight vest on, and I've got to take that weight vest off if I want to get up to the surface. Now, the sharks actually don't eat you when you're outside the cage if you're swimming toward them. They actually, if you loom on them, they steer away. That's the way that these cage exit divers are able to avoid getting eaten. Or if you're Ocean Ramsey, you just kind of understand them and you swim next to them. But I was genuinely frightened and stressed. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to shoot for the surface. I could see the silhouette of the boat. I'm going to shoot for the surface. I'll either get eaten or I'll drown, but I'm certain I'll drown if I stay here. And then what happened was one of the divers, his name's Brock, saw me.
Don't go up too fast.
Started kicking back toward me. And he's carrying this big vacuum cleaner size VR thing. And that felt like an eternity. You know, he's coming back to me slowly. And I'm just hoping if I pass out, I want to fall into the cage. If I float, I want to make sure I float up. But it was a good 20 or 30 more seconds, which doesn't sound like very long, but it's not like I got
that sounds like an eternity.
It was an eternity. So he made it back. We did the share air thing, but then we had a whole other problem, which was that we're sharing air. Those guys are out there. We're now on one tank, and the safeties are empty. So now there's a chance that we both might have to shoot for the surface. So fortunately, everybody made it back in time, and we got up.
No one ever gets me to draw this guy.
But I will never forget that experience. I do feel like I'm on borrowed time, and I did feel quite traumatized by it. And I will say that that night I did one thing, and the next day I did something else. Was that night I was able to sleep. I did yoga nidra, and I was able to calm my mind and my nerves. And the next day, because I understand a bit about the relationship between trauma and exposure, I did go back down the very next day, and I cage exited. And some people might think that's foolish. I certainly didn't do it to be tough or to seem like I'm tough. I did it because facing the trauma is the best way to purge the trauma. We know this. And cage exiting for me allowed me, I believe, to report the experience. I feel nothing in my body, no tension, no stress, no quaking or anything related to that. So I do think it's been completely purged.
Cool.
I want to dig into what I read as a definition of fear from you, and just to hear more about your fascination with fear and where it comes from. So here's what I have, and you can fact check this, please. Quote, fear, it's the anxiety that you feel when you don't know what behavior can remove a feeling of helplessness in the face of a threat, end quote. Does that sound right to you?
You can't have stress without anxiety.
Right.
You can't have trauma without stress,
Next.
but you can have stress or anxiety without trauma. I think that the key variables are anxiety is a state of heightened alertness.
I can see that.
Contracting of the visual field, quickening of the heart rate, breathing, all the kind of standard stuff that we hear of sympathetic nervous system.
That's what it is, orange
But
jelly.
the mental
That sounds
component
amazing.
is one in which time is being sliced very finely. So you're constantly
Brian, what up?
anticipating and evaluating your environment and your internal state. Because oftentimes people are
Damn, we've
aware
already
of
been drawing for an
so-called
hour.
interoception. They're keenly aware of how nervous they
Okay,
are.
last but not least.
And this element of uncertainty, of being unable to predict when it's going to pass. And this creates a kind of meta stress. It's sort of like when people have trouble sleeping, then they create this kind of meta anxiety and insomnia. They're stressed about not sleeping, and so then it makes it even harder to sleep. The same thing with stress. The more we stress, the more we want the stress to pass. And I think that resolving the uncertainty element is powerful, and I think it starts by taking control of the mind through the route of the body. When our mind is not stable, whatever that means, but we're not able to control our mental state, or it's not where we'd like it to be, we need to look to the powers of respiration, of vision, of movement, of weight training, of running, to reorient the mind. I think it is futile to try and rescue thinking with thinking. Now, it's not to say that thinking and an exploration of the mind, like with psychoanalysis or journaling, is not powerful, but for restabilizing our system, these brain states of mind and body, I think the body is the more powerful entry point.
And have you always been fascinated by fear, or why did that become a focal point?
Probably because I was the kid that was last to drop in on the ramp. Probably because I have lived and existed with a fair amount of fear. This seems to have gotten better over the years. For instance, I can remember skateboarding home.
You get to draw
bike path that used to
Arcana.
connect the school that I went to, the back of some houses, and I would push back through there at night, and I would start to imagine that terrible things were going to happen to me. I think that fear was a strong default, and I can't assign that to any earlier experience. I think I just had a lot of baseline anxiety and fear, and so resolving that and figuring out tools that people could use, that I could use also, to resolve those things really fast has been a major effort of my life, including my laboratory.
I'd like to, if it's okay with you, shift gears a little bit and just pepper you with a bunch of random questions that have absolutely no
Very
continuity
cool.
with anything we just talked about.
Great.
That's okay.
Wow, this person's art is awesome.
All right, because I have this sort of scratch pad full of these various things that I want to ask about, often without a whole lot of context, just from various
That's pretty
reading and so on.
legit.
So turmeric's effects on DHT. Could you elaborate on this? So DHT,
Alright, we found you,
I'm
Rice
guessing.
Fox.
What should we know about DHT and turmeric's effects on DHT? And I ask in
Oh,
part
that's
because
cool.
it's something that I use all the time in cooking. There seems to be some research to suggest that products like Theracumin, I believe it's called, is the brand name, might attenuate some risk related to, say, neurodegenerative disease or Alzheimer's. So I'd love to know more about this.
Yeah, so brief
Rice
endocrinology
Fox.
lesson on
Okay, we
testosterone.
got you, homie.
Testosterone is the androgen, of course, that's responsible for muscle growth, deepening the voice, aggression, sex drive, etc. But DHT, dihydrotestosterone, is made from testosterone through an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. DHT is the more powerful androgen, anywhere from 300 to 600 times the affinity for the androgen
Per
receptor.
canine.
DHT is and its affinity for the androgen receptor, not so incidentally, is the basis of nandrolone, DECA, known in gym circles. Actually, a female runner that was a good pick for the 1500 just got a 4-year ban.
Oops.
For a nandrolone positive test. She claims, and her coach claims, that it came from a burrito containing pork with nandrolone. I actually would love somebody to go explore. We're going to see more of this in the years to come. I'd like somebody to actually analyze meat for clenbuterol and nandrolone to just see, because and I'm not happy that this happened, or it's a sad situation, but we could fairly say that there's been a dark shadow cast by a burrito over the Olympic qualifications.
It's kind of
anyway,
like when all the sprinters
Nice.
were diagnosed as narcoleptics. You remember that with
really?
modafinil? Yeah, they were all on modafinil and various stimulants, and so they had these scripts from their doctors and letters saying they were all narcoleptics. It's just amazing. The Venn diagram.
To get them quick out the blocks. That's where the race is won. Hear that gun and get out the blocks. So nandrolone is DECA. The reason people take it, whether or not
Just
you
a
took
big
it,
dog.
The reason people
This
take
is
it
how you draw
because
R-canine.
DHT, as the more powerful androgen with this higher affinity, is the one that's mainly.
You guys are international, bros. I need to come visit
Many of
England.
the cognitive effects of testosterone. One of the more powerful effects of testosterone is that because of the fact that there are androgen receptors in the amygdala, that it has a fear suppressing component to it. And DHT, testosterone, but really DHT, has a property of making effort feel good. That's probably the main psychological effect of testosterone, aside from its effects on libido and the body periphery. So some people are very DHT sensitive. If you're somebody, for instance, that takes creatine and experiences hair loss very quickly, you're probably DHT sensitive. That's because creatine increases DHT. DHT will promote hair loss on the scalp, like my hairline's retreating quite nicely now because of DHT receptors here, and it promotes beard growth. So it has these inverse effects on the face and on the scalp. But turmeric is a fairly potent DHT antagonist. Now, whether or not it does that by occupation of the androgen receptor or some other mechanism, I don't know. People will vary in their sensitivity. I am very sensitive to turmeric. If I take turmeric, my DHT levels plummet. And I'm not taking nandrolone, nor am I eating pork burritos. But the sensitivity will vary, and you can kind of predict that sensitivity by how you react to creatine. If you're somebody that takes low doses of creatine, which many people do, and experience hair loss, chances are when you take turmeric, you're going to see a reduction in DHT. It means that your 5-alpha reductase system and or this interaction between turmeric and the androgen receptor are, for whatever reason, more sensitive in you. Some people take turmeric and feel perfectly fine. I noticed an immediate blunting of all the good stuff, let's say, that DHT and testosterone.
Let's draw a hairless growlith.
Even a minimum of turmeric. Now, that doesn't mean I can't have a little bit of turmeric in a drink, like a juice drink or something. But dosing turmeric is not something that I do or that I recommend for people. Now, women do make a little bit of DHT. It might be a whole different story with them, but I think for men, you probably just want to do the experiment. It's quickly reversible if you stop taking turmeric, so you could evaluate this. Some people will be fine. You could do a blood test, you could do it subjectively.
Is finasteride, Propecia, that is often used for mitigating hair loss, that is, I think it's a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor.
No.
Would that also have the effect of decreasing DHT levels? I want to say there are anecdotal reports, and people, please do your own homework. Go to PubMed and do some research. But I want to say that at least among strength athletes that I've heard anecdotal reports of Propecia use correlating to decreases in strength gains for male athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly can reduce DHT levels, certainly more for those that are sensitive to it. Just to underscore how powerful DHT is, we have what are called primary and secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics are like body hair, deepening the voice, etc. But the primary characteristics, like the presence of a penis or not, and this is independent of gender, this is just biological sex, it's encoded by the Y chromosome, that's entirely controlled by DHT during development. And masculinization of the brain is a separate pathway. But there's this phenomenon that I think is in the Dominican Republic, a genetic disruption in some of these pathways, and people can look this up, the so-called huevidosis. This is a famous story in endocrinology of children that look female at birth by genitalia, and then because of a surge in DHT later, they literally sprout a penis and testicles descend at about age 12.
What?
Wow.
And there's a whole story there. It actually was part of the story that helped neuroendocrinologists and developmental biologists understand the role of 5-alpha reductase in testosterone's conversion to DHT. Fascinating biology there. Much too much to go into now in detail, but people can look it up online. DHT is powerful in development, and it's powerful throughout the lifespan. So you want to keep levels of DHT appropriately high. But don't take nandrolone if you're sprinting in the Olympics. So that's not the way to get your... nandrolone is not the way to get your DHT.
Yeah. Even if you do get it through anabolic piggies, just it's just like there's so many more cost-effective ways to make pigs grow. Deca-durabolin injections is probably not high on the list.
They need natty menus, right? They need menus that are like, if you're an Olympic athlete, please just prepare your own food.
Yeah,
Hairless
exactly.
growlith.
So many directions to go here. It makes me wonder also if anyone has looked at turmeric or curcumin or whatever the actual compound is responsible for this DHT inhibition.
I think this is her character.
5-alpha
That's
reductase
dope.
or otherwise on pregnancy and birth gender. I'm wondering if that would have any effect. If DHT is suppressed in a woman who is pregnant, if that would have any effect on birth gender.
Yeah, that's a topic that I don't think the experiment's ever been done, but my postdoc advisor, Ben Barris, was transgendered, and it's an interesting story. Briefly, he was an identical twin. From a very early age, he felt entirely uncomfortable in a female body. He knew he wanted to be male from a very young age, long before puberty. His sister, who I've interacted with as well, is perfectly happy being a woman, enjoys being a woman. And they're identical twins. And their mother was actually treated with an androgenic drug during pregnancy. Ben unfortunately passed away of pancreatic cancer a few years ago. He was an incredibly accomplished neuroscientist and physician. His name is Barris, B-A-R-R-E-S. There are a number of obituaries. I wrote one for Nature that describes his life and his transition and some of the biology. But nonetheless, Ben and I spent about a year before he died. I recorded a lot of conversations with Ben that I haven't released yet, talking about what it was like to be a girl, what it was like to be a woman, what it was like to be a man later in life. Just as he's a close friend of mine, I want to understand that. And he described that this was an immediate effect. As soon as he knew there was a difference between boys and girls, he knew that he was in the wrong body. He likened it to if you woke up tomorrow and you were in a gorilla's body. That's how uncomfortable it was, knowing that's how he described it. And he thought that perhaps, this early androgenic drug treatment might have shaped his brain differently than his sister's somehow.
Raises so many interesting questions about phytoestrogens or sort of these xenoestrogens and the environmental inputs that could affect that entire biochemical cocktail to different outputs. Testosterone. So we've talked a little bit about DHT. There's a Goldilocks range depending on your gender and your objectives for testosterone. Are there any particular supplements that you use to, I hesitate to use this word because it's so goal dependent, but to optimize your testosterone or DHT levels?
Tell me that's my hair.
Sex hormone binding globulin or whatever. If you're sort of toying with your androgens, how do you like to do it?
Optimizing and or understanding testosterone, I think, is vital for men and women because it's so powerful. Obviously, get your sleep right. That's an important one, and you do that through. So that's an indirect.
Yours effect. Go on the side.
Keep chronic stress to a minimum. That's an indirect effect. Train hard but not too long. That's an indirect effect, mostly. In the supplementation space, there are two things that have worked very well for me and that I've recommended to a number of people that have worked well for them. And those two things are Tongat Ali, which at 400 milligrams per day is thought to reduce sex hormone binding globulin because for those that don't know, testosterone can exist in a free or bound form. people hear binding globulins and they bind up testosterone and prevent free testosterone. They think this is terrible, but actually albumin and sex hormone binding globulin are wonderful because they ensure that whatever testosterone you make will be delivered to your tissues over a long period of time. And different tissues need different amounts of testosterone. And so you don't want to plummet sex hormone binding globulin, but Tonga Ali, either through reducing sex hormone binding globulin or through direct effects on increasing androgen release, will increase your testosterone. Now, the way to explore this, and I'm not saying anyone should do this, you definitely want to work with your physician, but the way to explore this is 400 milligrams per day taken once per day early in the day, because it can have a little bit of a stimulant effect, make you more alert. That works well. It does need to be taken chronically. It tends to work better as you get into the second and third month of use. And I don't see any reason to cycle it unless somehow something, spikes on your liver enzymes or something. The other supplement that is quite useful is Phaedogia agrestis. Phaedogia agrestis is one of these plant alkaloids that I think it comes from a Nigerian shrub. I might have that wrong, but Phaedogia agrestis acts as a luteinizing hormone mimic. So it actually stimulates the testes to produce more testosterone.
So it's like HCG. It's a
bit like HCG, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to increase estrogen, which is unique because HCG will increase estrogen. Now, just anecdotally, I started using those in combination. So it's 400 milligrams of Tonga Ali. I have no relationship to the company, so I can mention where I get it from, although I hope they don't sell out they will sell out as a consequence. Solare makes a good version of this. Sometimes these things are packaged in with other things, but Solare has a pure form. And then Phaedogia agrestis, I think it's Herbal Elixirs makes a Phaedogia agrestis. And some people make the mistake of taking far too much Phaedogia agrestis. I think on the bottle they recommend 2 to 3 times a day. One 425 milligram capsule, I believe, is more than sufficient. And anecdotally, for me, what this did is it increased my total testosterone by about 200 points. So I fell kind of in the middle of the range. I was neither high nor low. I was at about 600, hovering somewhere around 600.
Right.
These two supplements consistently bring it up into the high 7s or low 8s, which is in the direction that I wanted to go.
Do you think Phaedogia agrestis, if it is luteinizing hormone similar, meaning it's a mimic of sorts, do you think that would have any... I guess it probably would have a sort of down-regulating effect on endogenous production of LH?
Well, what's interesting is when I've done my blood work twice a year, at least for me, it did not down-regulate LH, which is nice because things like HCG definitely would down-regulate LH. People who take testosterone cypionate, so-called TRT, or similar, will see a down-regulation in luteinizing hormone. So Phaedogia and Tonga Ali, I mentioned because they're sort of an intermediate between doing nothing with respect to supplements or taking things that don't really work. There are a lot of those out there, or taking the full plunge into TRT. And I'll just mention, if I may, about TRT. There's a lot of interest and excitement in TRT. They now even have what's called sports TRT, which is not...
And just for people who don't have the context, if I'm not sure if you already kind of named it out, but testosterone replacement therapy, TRT. So
right.
What's sports TRT? Is this like med spa type stuff?
Yeah. So people are probably wondering, wait, you're a neurobiologist. Why do you know so much about this stuff? Well, I have the good fortune of doing work with various high-performing communities, and there's just a lot of discussion around hormone and neural augmentation. And so I'm not making recommendations. What I generally do with those communities and what I'm doing now is point people to the fact that there are things that lie somewhere between doing nothing and going the prescription drug route.
Eating pork burritos.
Yeah, exactly. In the realm of TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, the typical dosages that people use are 160 to 200 milligrams a week, but the way it's administered doesn't match the biology. I think this is a serious problem that needs to be dealt with. Typically, if you get a prescription, you'll go in, they'll give you one injection of anywhere from 160 to 200 milligrams, and then you go back 2 weeks later and you get another injection. The testes normally make anywhere from about 5 to 10 milligrams of testosterone a day. So if you're taking 160 milligrams of testosterone on one day, you're going to set in motion all sorts of cascades of aromatization into estrogen, conversion into DHT, that you might feel terrible then, great 4 days later, and then so-so 2 weeks later. The way people are doing this now more intelligently is to do their injections at home, either into subcutaneously or into muscle, and every third or fourth day to take a low dose of maybe 40 milligrams and to dose it more evenly, because these long-lasting forms like cypionate do release over time. But sports TRT is this intermediate that's been created on the internet where people are neither doing testosterone replacement therapy to get levels up to normal or high normal, nor are they doing what the gym rats call blasting. They're not taking 300, 400, or 500. They're taking 200 a week or 300 a week. And the amount of self-directed pharmacology that's happening out there is pretty incredible. And like, I don't pass judgment. Everybody, it's your life to live, but there are a lot of horror stories too. You can really mess yourself up by getting androgen levels too high. I'm a fan of gently moving into the supplementation space for this, seeing how it works, doing a blood test. And then if people want to do TRT over time, that's certainly their right. That's not my place to judge. And you need a prescription anyway. So you have to talk to a doctor.
Yeah, and just a couple of additional thoughts on all of this stuff. Well, first, the lower dose, higher frequency regimen can also be applied to many things, right? Growth hormone would be another example from the same sort of portfolio of interventions / augmentations that a lot of folks would use. And separately, I would say, and please feel free to correct me or fact check on this, but whether you're eating pork burritos, injecting yourself with anabolics of different types, or eating deer antler velvet, or whatever the latest fad is that people claim increases testosterone, if you dramatically increase your testosterone levels, if you are not taking an anti-aromatase, you are also going to increase your estrogen levels, even though it depends on the anabolic, obviously. And nandrolone is very different from different types of testosterone and so on, which, you know, some are more anabolic, some are more androgenic. But if you suddenly wallop yourself with much higher levels of testosterone, you are also going to, a portion of that will be converted to estrogen. And so it's just something to be aware of, right? It's very hard to get a biological free lunch.
That's right.
And if you're feeding yourself a bunch of stuff and your testes, like the Siberian, what were they, albino rats?
The Siberian hamsters. That's right.
Yeah, Siberian hamsters.
That's
right. If your balls go from whatever your comfortable ball diameter is down to like raisins, you may require post-cycle therapy, PCT, various drugs to successfully off-ramp from these types of interventions, unless, like some powerlifters, you're just going to be loaded all year round, 365, 24/7, which
I don't know. These guys are talking about
your choice if
something
you want to do something
else
like
now.
that. But
I'm glad you.
Good idea to get
Lynn,
medical supervision for all these
Definitely.
things.
And
so that's pretty much it. Just wanted to sketch those three.
Actually will cause a fairly, not pronounced, but
I may be back later, but you guys will get the notification. I'm going to stop this for now. Yeah, that's it. I got other stuff to do. I just wanted to sketch a few things first. But yeah, Skylar, what up? It's negative 35 here too. Alright guys, just gonna put this aside. Oh no, there's just something there. It's okay. These are the sketches we did today. This one's gonna be fun. Holy, we actually sketched a lot. Sick. 5 drawings. Oh man, when did I fold these? Oh. Cool. Flygon. That's awesome, man. Cool. I'm gonna ink and color them eventually. Some of these are just gonna stay as sketches, but I wanted to get the roughs down at least. Fly, yes, kind of. I mean, you can only do so many of them, but I plan on doing the other new generation starters and then putting all of the, or recreating my fire type, leaf type, and water type starter, like where all of them are together in one picture. I don't think I've done that since the 6th generation. Alright guys, yeah, that's it for this, I was gonna say vlog, this live stream. If I don't see you between now until Christmas, Merry Christmas, and thanks for joining me. Peace.